They found the third one on a Tuesday. Not her body, her silence. Lady Margot Ashby returned to her homeland across the Eastern Sea, and she never spoke again. Not a single word. The physicians who examined her said there was nothing wrong with her throat, nothing damaged in her jaw or tongue. She simply chose, with the absolute conviction of someone who had stared into a furnace, to never open her mouth again. That was 3 years ago, and in the kingdom of Valdrin, where whispers moved faster than horses, the story had already grown teeth. Ethan Hale, Alpha King of Valdrin, had taken 3 women into his confidence. 3 women had shared his evenings, his table, his trust. The first, Lady Serena, fell from the East Tower window on a calm night without wind. The court ruled it an accident. The second, a merchant's daughter named Brielle, disappeared so completely that even her father stopped asking questions after a velvet box arrived containing her rings and nothing else. And the third, Margot, came back hollow. No woman survived a night with the Alpha King, that was the saying. Mothers used it to warn their daughters, generals used it to remind their soldiers who held the leash, and the 5 lords of the conclave, the real power behind the throne of Valdrin, used it to sleep peacefully in their enormous beds, because as long as the world feared the king, nobody looked twice at them. Claire Whitmore did not care about any of this. She cared about the fact that 9 children in the village of Dunmore had developed a cough that sounded like paper tearing, and that 4 of them had stopped breathing before she could reach them. She cared about the black residue she had scraped from the inside of a dead boy's water cup. She cared about the way the sickness moved, not like a disease at all, but like a delivery, appearing in one household and skipping the next with the precision of a postman. Claire was 26, a field medic. She had spent 4 years on the border wars, stitching soldiers back together, with thread she sometimes had to boil twice because supplies ran out before courage did. She had calloused hands, a jaw that had been broken and reset by a surgeon who apologized while he did it, and a way of looking at powerful men that made them feel, for reasons they could never quite articulate, slightly smaller than they had felt a moment before. She arrived at the capital on a gray morning, carrying a leather bag full of medical notes and a sample of the black residue sealed in a glass vial. She needed access to the royal archives, specifically the medical texts from the reign of Ethan's grandfather, King Aldrich. There were references in older field manuals to a similar sickness 60 years ago, a cough that had swept through the southern provinces with the same tearing sound, the same impossible precision. The cure, whatever it had been, was recorded somewhere in those archives. Claire did not request an audience with the king. She requested access to a library. The fact that the library belonged to a man the entire continent considered a monster was, to her, an administrative inconvenience on the same level as a broken door hinge. She was granted an audience anyway. The throne room was smaller than she expected. Every story she had ever heard about Ethan Hale painted him against a backdrop of towering architecture, vast halls, the kind of space designed to make a visitor feel like an insect. The reality was a room that might generously be called medium, with stone walls that needed repointing, and a chair on a raised platform that looked less like a throne and more like something a tired man sat in because standing required energy he had stopped pretending to have. Ethan Hale was 28. He did not look 28. He looked like 28 had happened to him several times in a row, without a break in between. Dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as his walls, eyes the color of winter rivers, and just as inviting. He was, Claire noticed with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent 4 years surrounded by men in various states of undress, put together in a way that would make most women lose approximately 40% of their decision-making capacity. She noted this the way she might note a structural weakness in a bridge. Relevant, potentially dangerous, not her problem today. "You want my library," he said, "not a question. I want your grandfather's medical records from the southern province outbreak of 60 years ago," she said. "Specifically the treatment protocols for a respiratory illness that presented with a tearing cough and dark residue in the airways." Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker. gone before she could name it. You came a long way for old books. Children are dying in Dunmore. Children die everywhere. Not like this. This sickness does not spread the way diseases spread. It chooses its houses. It skips families that share walls with the infected. No disease does that. Someone is delivering it. The silence in the room changed temperature. Claire felt it. The guards at the door felt it. Even the dust in the air seemed to slow down, as if the particles themselves wanted to hear what the king would say next. He said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up, which was a production in itself, because Ethan Hale's standing turned out to be significantly more vertical than she had prepared for. He was tall in the way that doorframes become suggestions rather than boundaries. "I will show you the library myself," he said. This was unusual. Kings do not escort field medics to libraries. Kings summon stewards, who summon librarians, who summon assistants, who eventually point you toward a dusty room and warn you not to touch the illuminated manuscripts. But Ethan Hale walked beside her through corridors that smelled of old stone and candle wax, and Claire noticed three things in quick succession. First, every servant they passed dropped their gaze to the floor, not out of respect, out of something closer to self-preservation, the way animals go still when a predator's shadow passes overhead. Second, the king's hands were shaking, not visibly, not to anyone who was not trained to read a body for signs of distress. But Claire had spent 4 years taking pulses on the battlefield, and she could spot a tremor at 20 paces. His left hand, specifically, a fine vibration that he controlled by keeping his fist closed. Third, he was watching her the way she watched patients, reading her, checking for symptoms, not of illness, but of fear. She was not afraid of him. This was not bravery on her part. Claire had used up her lifetime supply of fear in a field hospital on the northern border when a man she was trying to save grabbed her wrist and squeezed until the bones ground together and something snapped. She had set her own jaw back into alignment while he bled out on the table, and afterward she had eaten dinner and gone to bed and woken up the next morning and done it all again. Fear was a resource, and she had spent hers. What she operated on now was something flatter, something more efficient. Purpose without the luxury of emotional color. The library was magnificent. 2 stories of dark wood shelves, a gallery running the upper level, windows that let in the kind of gray light that makes text on old pages glow. Claire felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in weeks. Books. Clean, organized, categorized books. After weeks of mud and sickness and the sound of children coughing until they could not cough anymore, the library was a room that made sense. "The medical texts are in the eastern alcove," Ethan said. "My grandfather was thorough. He documented everything." "Not everything," Claire said. "I have read the field manual copies. 3 chapters are missing from every edition after the 32nd year of his reign. Someone removed them." That flicker again, behind his eyes. A door opening and closing so fast you could only be sure it had happened because of the draft it left behind. "Then I hope you find what you are looking for," he said, and he left. Claire stood alone in the library and listened to his footsteps retreat down the corridor. She counted them, 27 steps to the corner. A pause. Then the footsteps resumed, slightly faster, as if he had stopped to decide something and decided it badly. She turned to the shelves and began to work. For 11 days, Claire lived inside the library. She slept in the east wing, in a room at the end of a corridor that the servants called the Quiet Hall, which Claire quickly understood was a polite way of saying the hall where Lady Serena had fallen from the tower window 3 floors above. The servants brought her meals with the cautious generosity of people feeding a condemned woman her last supper. They left fresh linens outside her door each morning. They never entered the room. She did not mind. Solitude was the only luxury she had ever been able to afford, and she spent it well, reading until the candles burned to stubs, cross-referencing Aldrich's medical logs with her own field notes, building a map of the sickness that grew more disturbing with every connection she drew. The missing chapters were not the only gaps. Someone had been through these archives recently, within the last 5 years, and removed specific pages with surgical precision. Not entire volumes, individual pages, always the ones documenting treatments, cures, the chemical composition of medicines used during the outbreak 60 years ago. Whoever had done this understood medicine. They knew exactly which pages mattered and which ones could safely be left behind to maintain the illusion of completeness. Claire found the cuts by checking the page numbering. Page 106 would jump to page 109. A casual reader would never notice. Claire was not a casual reader. Claire was a woman who counted footsteps and noticed tremors in fists, and could tell, by the weight of a glass vial, whether the residue inside was mineral or organic. She was being watched. She knew this because the library had a second entrance, hidden behind a panel in the eastern alcove, and on 3 separate occasions she heard the soft press of weight on old wood from behind it. Someone standing there, listening, breathing so quietly that a person with less training might have mistaken it for the settling of the building. On the 7th day she spoke to the panel without turning around. If you are going to eavesdrop, you might as well bring coffee. The breathing stopped. Footsteps retreated. 20 minutes later, a servant arrived with a tray carrying the best coffee Claire had tasted in 4 years. On the 9th day, Ethan came to the library in person. He sat across from her at the reading table, a massive oak thing scarred with centuries of ink stains and candle drips, and he watched her work without speaking for nearly an hour. Claire did not acknowledge him. She was deep in a cross-reference that was making her hands cold, with the kind of understanding that arrives not as an idea, but as a physical sensation, the dropping feeling in the stomach when you realize the bridge you are standing on is not a bridge. "You are not going to find those pages," he said. "I already know what was on them," she said, still not looking up. "I do not need the pages. I need confirmation." "Confirmation of what?" She looked up. "That the sickness in Dunmore is not a sickness. That it is a weapon. That someone manufactured it, tested it on the southern villages, and has been refining it for at least 60 years. Ethan Hale did not flinch. He did not deny it. He did not perform surprise or outrage or any of the emotions a king should perform when a field medic from the border accuses his kingdom of producing weapons that target children. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped. What she saw underneath was not a monster. It was exhaustion so deep it had fossilized, a tiredness that had stopped being a feeling years ago and had become instead the material his bones were made of. "Now you understand," he said quietly, "why no one leaves." Claire did not leave. She sat at that oak table while the candles burned low and the shadows climbed the library walls, and she listened to Ethan Hale explain, in the flat voice of a man who had been carrying a secret so heavy it had reshaped his spine, the truth about the kingdom of Valdrin. He was not the king. He wore the crown. He sat on the chair. He signed the documents and received the ambassadors and ate the ceremonial dinners while the court painted his portrait for the gallery. But the kingdom was run, and had been run for 100 years, by 5 people who called themselves the Conclave: Lord Philip Crane, Lord Marcus Grey, Lady Catherine Vane, Lord Henry Ashworth, Lord Simon Blackthorne. 5 families, 5 fortunes, 5 sets of hands on the gears of a machine that the king was not permitted to touch. Ethan's grandfather had known. His father had known. Both had tried, in their own ways, to dismantle the conclave from within. His grandfather lasted 40 years before a hunting accident that was not an accident. His father lasted 12 before a fever that arrived too conveniently and departed only after it had taken his life. Ethan had been 22 when the crown landed on his head, and by 23 he understood the terms of the arrangement. The conclave controlled the treasury, the military appointments, the trade agreements, and the southern provinces where most of the kingdom's agriculture was concentrated. The king controlled the library and the right to eat dinner at the head of the table. If the king behaved, the kingdom functioned. If the king did not behave, the people he cared about would begin to have accidents. Serena had not fallen from the tower. She had been pushed. She had found a document in the king's private study, a shipping manifest that connected Lord Crane's merchant fleet to a laboratory in the southern mountains. She had asked Ethan about it over breakfast, casually, the way you might ask about weather. By evening she was gone. Ethan was in the East Wing when it happened. He heard nothing. He was told in the morning. Brielle had been cleverer and more careful. A merchant's daughter. She understood logistics in a way that nobles never could, and she had tracked the flow of money from the Conclave's accounts to a series of purchases that made no sense unless you knew what they were building. Medical equipment, glass containers, chemical compounds that had no agricultural or medicinal application. She had compiled a ledger. The ledger disappeared. Then she disappeared. The rings that arrived at her father's house were a message, not a cruelty. They were the Conclave saying, with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing this for a century, "We know what you found, and we know who you told, and the next delivery will contain more than jewelry." Margot had simply been in the wrong room at the wrong time. A diplomat's wife, visiting from across the sea, she had wandered into a section of the palace that was supposed to be locked. What she saw there, Ethan did not know. But whatever it was had been sufficient to warrant a visit from Lord Ashworth's personal physician, a man whose medical skills ran in directions that no oath of healing would sanction. "I could not stop any of it," Ethan said. His voice was the same temperature as the stone walls. "I tried. With Serena, I tried. I went to Crane directly, told him I knew what he had done. He smiled at me. He said, and I remember the exact words because I have replayed them every night for 5 years, he said, 'Your father tried this too, and we both know how that ended.'" Claire's hands were flat on the table. She was very still. The laboratory in the southern mountains, is it still operational? It was moved. Here, into the palace, 3 years ago. Here, below the library, there is a passage behind the eastern alcove, through a door that bears my sigil. They use my seal on everything. If it is ever discovered, the evidence points to the crown. Claire thought about the breathing she had heard behind the panel, the coffee that arrived 20 minutes after she spoke to it. "You have been watching me since I arrived." "I have been watching you since you walked into the throne room and told me that children were dying as if you expected me to do something about it. Do you know how long it has been since someone spoke to me as if I were a person who could act? Not a figurehead, not a monster, a person." She did not answer that. Instead she said, "Show me the laboratory." He showed her. The passage behind the panel led down a narrow staircase carved from the same stone as the library walls, spiraling into the earth with the reluctant geometry of something that was never meant to be found. The air changed as they descended. It became colder, sharper, tinged with a chemical tang that Claire recognized from the field hospitals where they cleaned instruments with solutions strong enough to strip paint. The laboratory was larger than the library above it. Rows of glass containers lined the walls, each one labeled in a precise hand with notations that Claire could read because she had been trained in pharmaceutical chemistry during the border wars. Growth cultures, incubation timelines, dosage calculations, dispersal methods. She walked along the containers slowly, reading. Her field training kept her breathing steady, kept her hands at her sides, kept her face arranged in an expression that could pass for professional interest. But inside, in the place where she kept the things she would deal with later, something was cracking. These were not experiments. These were production lines. Whoever was running this laboratory was manufacturing the sickness at scale, bottling it, preparing it for distribution. The labels on the containers referenced locations: Dunmore, Ashford, Belwick, Cressley, village names, southern village names. Names Claire knew because she had walked their streets and listened to their children cough. "How long?" she said. "The current operation, 3 years. But the research goes back to my grandfather's time, 60 years. And the cure, was there ever a cure? There was. My grandfather commissioned it when the sickness first appeared, and he did not yet know the Conclave was behind it. The cure worked. The Conclave destroyed every copy of the formula and ensured the physician who created it retired to a small house by the sea where he lived out his remaining years in comfort and total silence." Claire picked up a container, held it to the light. Inside, suspended in a clear solution, was the same black residue she had scraped from a dead boy's water cup in Dunmore. She set it down. "You said no one leaves," she said. "But you could have left. You could have abdicated, taken a horse, crossed the border, lived out your life somewhere, without the crown and without the conclave, and left the southern provinces to them. You have left the southern provinces to them. You have been king for 6 years, and children are still dying." The words landed like a slap. Ethan did not flinch, but something in his posture changed, a straightening that was not pride, but rather the physical expression of a wound being acknowledged. "Yes," he said. "They are." Claire picked up a notebook from the nearest workstation. She opened it. The handwriting was meticulous, the entries dated, the data organized with the cold precision of someone who understood that good science requires good records even when the science itself is monstrous. "I need 3 days with these notes," she said. "If anyone discovers you have been down here, I cannot protect you. I did not ask you to protect me." She took the notebook and went back up the stairs. Ethan stood alone in the laboratory, surrounded by the machinery of a horror he had inherited, and could not stop, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than the bone-deep exhaustion that had become his permanent weather. He felt the thin, dangerous edge of hope. Claire worked through the night, and the next night, and the night after that. She did not return to the laboratory. She did not need to. The notebook was enough. 60 years of research, meticulously documented, and all she had to do was read it backward. Every weapon has a mirror. Every poison has a structure, and every structure has a weakness. And if you understand the architecture of the thing that is killing people, you can reverse engineer the architecture of the thing that will save them. By the 3rd morning, she had a formula. Not a complete cure, not yet, but the skeleton of one. The sickness was engineered, which meant it followed rules, and rules could be broken by someone who understood them. She needed ingredients she did not have. She needed equipment the palace library could not provide. She needed, more than anything, to get this formula to the southern provinces before another child stopped breathing. She also needed to sleep. Her hands were shaking, not with the controlled tremor she had observed in Ethan's fist, but with the graceless vibration of a body that has been pushed past its operational limits and is beginning to file formal complaints. She fell asleep at the library table, with her face pressed against page 47 of the notebook. The ink left a mirror image smudge on her cheek, a backwards equation that read, to anyone who happened to walk in and see it, like the world's most academic war paint. Ethan walked in and saw it. He stood in the doorway of the library and looked at a woman asleep on his table with pharmaceutical equations printed on her face, and her hand still curled around a pen that had run out of ink an hour ago, but which she had continued to hold, because letting go of things was not something Claire Whitmore did without a fight. The East Wing was not safe. He knew this because Lord Crane had posted 2 additional guards at the end of the quiet hall yesterday, guards who reported to the conclave and not to the crown, and their presence meant that someone in the conclave's network had noticed that the field medic from the border was spending an unusual amount of time in the library. He picked her up, not romantically, not gently in the way that stories describe when the hero lifts the heroine. He picked her up the way you pick up a wounded soldier, efficiently, and with the understanding that the goal is to move a body from a dangerous location to a less dangerous one. She was lighter than he expected, and heavier than she looked, which is the way of people who are made mostly of determination and bone. She did not wake up. This told him 2 things. First, that she was exhausted beyond the reach of normal caution. Second, that some part of her, some subconscious machinery that had spent 4 years on the border learning to sort threats from non-threats, had decided that being carried by the Alpha King of Valdrin did not register as danger. He brought her to his chambers, set her on the bed, pulled a blanket over her. Then he sat in the chair by the window and watched the corridor through the gap in the door, because the conclave's guards would not enter the king's quarters without authorization, and authorization required a majority vote, and at 3 in the morning, The Conclave's bureaucracy was the closest thing Ethan Hale had to a defense system. She slept for 6 hours. He did not sleep at all. This was not unusual. Ethan had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 6 years. His body had long since stopped sending him signals of tiredness and had moved directly to a state of low-grade hallucination that he managed through sheer willpower and an unreasonable amount of coffee. When Claire woke, she was disoriented for exactly 4 seconds. She registered the unfamiliar room, the unfamiliar bed, the man sitting by the window with shadows under his eyes that looked like they had been applied with a trowel. She sat up. The blanket fell away. She looked at him. "The East Wing is compromised," he said, answering the question she had not asked. She touched her cheek, felt the dried ink, peeled a fragment of page 47 from her skin. "I have a formula," she said. "I know. I read your notes while you slept. That is a significant invasion of my privacy. I also memorized them. In case something happens to you, the formula survives." She stared at him. He stared back. Outside, the palace was waking up, the sounds of servants and guards beginning the choreographed routine of another day in a kingdom that ran on secrets and fear. Inside this room, 2 people who had forgotten what it felt like to be understood sat on opposite sides of a silence that neither of them tried to fill. "The servants will have seen you carry me," Claire said. "Yes. The entire palace will believe I spent the night in your chambers." "Yes. The Whisper Network will update. It already has." Claire swung her legs off the bed and stood up. She rolled her shoulders, cracked her neck, picked up the pen she was still holding, because of course she was still holding it, and tucked it behind her ear. "Good," she said. "Let them whisper. I have work to do." The formula needed 3 things Claire could not get inside the palace: a specific mineral compound found in the riverbed clay of the southern provinces, a distillation process that required equipment designed for medicine, not warfare, and a network of people she could trust to distribute the cure without getting caught by the Conclave's informants. She had the network already. 4 years on the border wars had given her something more valuable than any title or treasury. It had given her a web of field medics, supply runners, and village healers who had carried medicine through enemy territory, through mud and rain and nights so dark you navigated by the sound of the person breathing in front of you. These people did not work for kingdoms. They worked for the living, and when Claire sent a message through channels the Conclave did not know existed, the response came back in 2 days. "Ready. Send the formula. Tell us what you need." The mineral compound was the problem. The riverbed clay in Dunmore contained it naturally, but extracting it required knowledge that Claire had and equipment that she did not. She needed a proper medical workshop, the kind with glass distillation tubes and temperature-controlled heating elements, and the patience of a process that could not be rushed without ruining the compound. Ethan provided it. Not from the Conclave's laboratory beneath the library, which was too dangerous and too closely monitored, but from a room in the North Tower that had once belonged to his mother. She had been an herbalist before she was queen, a woman who married into the crown with dirt still under her fingernails and who had maintained a private workshop throughout her years at the palace. She had been dead for 15 years, but the room remained exactly as she left it, sealed on Ethan's orders, untouched by the Conclave, because they had never considered a dead queen's herb garden worth inventorying. Claire worked in the North Tower workshop for 5 days. Ethan brought her supplies. This was not romantic. It was logistical. The King of Valdrin carried boxes of glass tubes and chemical reagents up 4 flights of stairs because he could not send servants without creating a record, and he could not create a record without alerting the Conclave. So he carried. He climbed. His knees objected. His pride did not factor into the equation, because pride, like fear, was a luxury he had stopped affording. On the 2nd day, she showed him how to measure the mineral compound. He learned with the focused attention of someone who understands that knowledge is the only thing that cannot be taken from you by force. His hands, steadier when they had a task, weighed the powder with the precision she demanded. "You would have made a decent medic," she said, which was, by Claire Whitmore's standards, the equivalent of a standing ovation. "I was trained to be a king," he said, "which, as it turns out, requires exactly none of the skills that are actually useful." On the third day, the first batch of the cure was ready. Claire sealed it in glass vials, labeled each one with dosage instructions, and packed them in a wooden case lined with straw. The case went out of the palace through the kitchens, carried by a supply runner named Daniel, who had once walked 40 miles through contested territory with a box of surgical instruments strapped to his chest because the field hospital on the other side had run out of everything except desperation. Daniel did not ask questions. He did not need to. He looked at Claire, read the geography of her face, the particular set of her jaw that meant this is the thing that matters, and he took the case and disappeared into the city. 5 days later, a message arrived through the network. 3 words. "Kids are breathing." Claire read the message in the North Tower workshop, standing between the distillation equipment and a shelf of dried herbs that still smelled faintly of the Queen, who had planted them 15 years ago. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her pocket. Then she sat down on the stone floor and pressed her palms flat against the cold surface and breathed in a way she had not breathed in weeks, deep enough to reach the bottom of her lungs, the place where she kept the sound of children coughing. Ethan found her there 20 minutes later. He did not ask what was wrong, because nothing was wrong. Something was right, and the rightness of it had temporarily overwhelmed the machinery she used to keep moving. He sat down next to her on the stone floor without speaking, and they stayed like that, side by side with their backs against the wall of a dead queen's workshop, while the silence between them did the work that words were not built for. The conclave noticed. Not the cure, not yet. They noticed that children in Dunmore had stopped presenting at the village healer's door, that the coughing had eased, that the mortality reports from the southern provinces showed an anomaly, a dip, a deviation from the projected numbers. Lord Crane reviewed the reports personally and flagged the discrepancy, because Lord Crane was a man who understood numbers the way Claire understood medicine, with the cold intimacy of someone who has made their life's work out of precision. He called a meeting of the conclave. 5 lords and ladies in a room with a locked door, discussing the mathematics of expected versus actual deaths, the way a farmer might discuss a disappointing harvest. The conclusion was that the anomaly was likely environmental, a change in water source perhaps, a seasonal variation. But Lord Crane was not a man who accepted likely. He dispatched an investigator to Dunmore, a quiet man with a quiet manner and a talent for asking questions that sounded innocent until you realized you had answered them. Claire knew about the investigator because the network told her. The same runners who carried the cure carried information, and the information said that a man from the capital was asking questions in Dunmore about new medicines, about outsiders, about a woman who had visited the village 3 weeks before the sickness began to ease. She told Ethan. He received the information with the expression of a man watching a clock count down to a detonation he cannot prevent. "They will trace it back," he said. "Not to you specifically, not yet. But they will trace the cure back to this palace, and when they do, they will begin narrowing the list of people who had the knowledge and the access." "That list has 2 names on it," Claire said. "Yours and mine. Mine does not concern them. I am useful. A king who takes the blame for everything the conclave does is a valuable asset. They will not discard me unless they have a replacement ready. And me? You. They will discard, efficiently and without ceremony. I am not leaving." "I know. I did not ask you to leave. I ask you to understand what is coming." What was coming arrived on a silver tray in the form of an invitation. Lady Catherine Vane, the only woman on the conclave, requested the honor of Claire's presence at a formal dinner. The invitation was handwritten on cream paper with gold edges, and it smelled faintly of jasmine, which Claire found deeply unsettling, because jasmine was a scent she associated with funeral arrangements. The dinner was held in the West Hall, a long room with tall windows and a table that could seat 30, but tonight held only 7. 5 conclave members, the king, and Claire. Lord Crane sat at the head of the table. He was a thin man with thin hands, and the kind of face that rearranged itself into pleasantness, the way a trap rearranges itself into a flat piece of ground. He smiled at Claire when she sat down, and the smile reached all the way to his eyes, which meant he was either genuinely delighted to meet her or genuinely delighted to be the last person she would trust. Lady Vane sat to his left. She was older than Claire expected, silver-haired and elegant, with the posture of someone who had spent 60 years refusing to slouch and was not about to start now. She looked at Claire the way an entomologist looks at a new specimen, with interest, with distance, and with the unspoken understanding that the specimen does not get to leave the glass case. Lord Grey was enormous. Not fat, enormous. The kind of man who takes up space as a political statement, whose physical presence in a room is itself an argument. He ate with the steady, mechanical efficiency of someone refueling, and he did not look at Claire once during the entire first course. Lord Ashworth was the oldest. He white-haired, quiet, with hands that moved slowly and eyes that moved fast. He watched everything. He watched the servants pour the wine. He watched Claire cut her food. He watched Ethan sit down, watched the angle of his shoulders, watched the distance between the king's chair and Claire's chair, and filed all of it away in whatever system he used to catalogue the world. Lord Blackthorne was the youngest, perhaps 40, and the most openly hostile. He had the lean, angular look of a man who confused thinness with discipline, and he addressed Claire directly within the first 5 minutes. "We understand you are a field medic," he said. "How fascinating. I was not aware that the Crown was in need of medical consultation." "The Crown is not," Claire said. "The southern provinces are. The southern provinces are managed by the Conclave. Their medical needs are well attended to." "With respect, Lord Blackthorne, I have attended to their medical needs personally. The attendants could use improvement." A silence fell over the table that had the specific texture of 5 powerful people recalibrating their assessment of a threat level. Claire ate a piece of roasted quail. It was excellent. She noted this with the same clinical detachment with which she had noted the king's bone structure on their first meeting. Relevant, not her problem today. Ethan sat 2 chairs away from her. He had not spoken since sitting down. He was performing a version of himself that Claire had not seen before, a hollow-eyed, slightly unfocused version, a man who drank too much wine and stared at the middle distance and occasionally twitched at sounds that were not there. It was a performance so convincing that if Claire had not spent 3 weeks watching the real Ethan, the one who memorized pharmaceutical formulas and carried glass tubes up 4 flights of stairs, she would have believed it completely. He was showing them what they expected, the broken king, the puppet who dances when the strings are pulled. And while they watched his performance, while they congratulated themselves on the reliability of their creature, Claire sat among them with a cure in her memory and a network in her pocket, and the absolute certainty that these 5 people had been manufacturing the death of children for 60 years. Her hands stayed perfectly still in her lap. This was discipline, not calm. Inside, in the place where she kept the things she would deal with later, the cracking had become a fracture, and the fracture was filling with something hot and bright that she recognized because she had felt it before, in field hospitals and on battlefields, and in every room where powerful people discussed the disposability of powerless ones. She ate her quail. She answered questions about her work on the border with the precise minimum of information required by politeness. She complimented Lady Vane's wine selection. She did not look at Ethan, because looking at Ethan would mean acknowledging the performance, and acknowledging the performance would mean revealing that she knew there was a performer underneath it. Lord Crane asked her how long she planned to stay at the palace. "As long as the archives remain useful," she said. "And have they been useful?" "Immensely. King Aldrich was a meticulous record keeper. His documentation of southern province agriculture alone has been invaluable to my research. The lie was seamless. Agriculture, not medicine, not the manufactured disease, not the missing pages." Claire watched the lie land on Crane's face and watched his calculation adjust. She was studying farming records. She was a field medic interested in crop patterns. She was boring. She was safe. Ashworth did not buy it. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the slow turning of a mind that had survived 6 decades of court politics by trusting nothing and no one. But he did not voice it. Not here. Not yet. The dinner ended at 11. Claire walked back to the east wing alone. The corridor was dark and quiet, and lined with guards who watched her pass with expressions that sat somewhere between curiosity and pity. She reached her room, closed the door, leaned her back against it. Her hands were trembling, not the fine, controlled tremor she had seen in Ethan's fist, but the full, honest shaking of a body that has been held under such precise control for so many hours that the release, when it comes, is seismic. She pressed her palms flat against the door, counted her breaths, waited for the trembling to stop. It did not stop, so she worked anyway. She pulled out her notes, sat on the floor because the chair felt too far from the ground, and began calculating the next batch of the cure. Her handwriting was terrible. The numbers were perfect. At 2 in the morning, a sound in the corridor, footsteps, not the regular patrol of the East Wing guards. Something different, lighter, more deliberate. The footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and did not want anyone to hear them arrive. Claire picked up the heaviest thing within reach, which was a brass candlestick with the pleasing heft of something designed in an era when decorative objects were also functional weapons. She moved to the side of the door, out of the line of the frame, and waited. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A knock, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. She recognized the pattern because Ethan had used it on the North Tower workshop door for the last 5 days. She opened the door. He was not alone. Behind him, pressed against the corridor wall with the body language of a man trying to become architecture, was Daniel, the supply runner. He was supposed to be in Dunmore. He was not supposed to be in the capital. He was certainly not supposed to be inside the palace at 2 in the morning, standing in the corridor where Lady Serena had fallen. "We have a problem," Ethan said. Daniel had been intercepted. Not caught, not detained, but intercepted by Lord Crane's investigator on the road south of the capital. The investigator had asked friendly questions. Daniel had given friendly answers. But among the friendly answers, Daniel had mentioned, casually, as a matter of small talk, that he had recently delivered medical supplies to the southern provinces. The investigator had made a note. "He did not follow me," Daniel said. "I am certain of that." "You are certain," Claire said, "in the way that someone who has not been followed by a professional is always certain. I have been running through contested territory for 4 years. I know when I am being tracked. You have been running through territory contested by soldiers. Soldiers are loud, investigators are not." "Enough," Ethan said. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who has spent 6 years giving orders that no one follows, and has developed, out of necessity, the ability to make a single word do the work of a command. The question is not whether Daniel was followed. The question is whether the investigator has enough information to connect the medical supplies to the cure to this palace, and this palace to you. How much time do we have? The investigator reports to Lord Crane every 3rd day. The last report was yesterday. We have 2 days before the next one. 2 days, 48 hours. Claire looked at Daniel, looked at Ethan, looked at the brass candlestick she was still holding in her right hand, which she now set down on the bedside table with the careful precision of someone who has just realized they were prepared to hit the King of Valdrin with a decorative object. "Then we use the 2 days," she said. "I need to make more of the cure. Enough for every affected village, and I need to get it out of this palace and into the network before Crane closes the roads." "That is not possible in 2 days," Ethan said. "It is possible in 2 days if I do not sleep, you carry the supplies, and Daniel runs faster than he has ever run before." Daniel smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been told the bridge is out, and the river is rising, and the enemy is behind him, and who has heard all of this before, and is still standing. "I can run fast," he said. They worked through the night, and into the next day without stopping. Claire in the North Tower workshop, distilling and measuring and sealing vials with hands that had found their steadiness again, because the shaking stops when the work begins. Ethan on the stairs, carrying supplies, standing guard at the tower door, listening for footsteps in corridors that had more ears than walls. Daniel slept for 3 hours on the workshop floor, curled up between a shelf of dried herbs and a rack of glass tubes, and woke with the instant alertness of someone whose body treats rest as a tactical reload rather than a luxury. By the end of the first day, Claire had produced enough of the cure for 40 doses. Each vial was labeled, each dosage calculated for a child's weight, each instruction written in the shorthand that her field medic network would recognize. 40 doses, 40 children who would keep breathing. It was not enough. There were more than 40 sick children in the southern provinces. There were hundreds, but 40 was what she could make with what she had, and Claire had learned a long time ago that the difference between 0 and 40 was not a number. It was a world. Daniel left at midnight with the case strapped to his chest. He went through the kitchens, through a passage that led to the wine cellars, through a door in the cellar wall that opened onto an alley behind the Palace Bakery. Ethan had shown him the route. It was the same route his mother had used, years ago, to bring herbs in from the city market without going through the palace gates. Claire watched him go from the kitchen doorway. She did not say be careful because Daniel did not need to be told things he already was. She did not say thank you because gratitude was an emotion she would process later, when there was time, when the world had slowed down enough for feelings to be something other than a distraction. She said, the third village past the river fork, a girl named Nora, 7 years old. She was the worst when I left. Daniel nodded. He understood what she was saying. Start with her. Then he was gone, and the kitchen was quiet, and Claire stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides, and the chemical smell of the workshop still clinging to her clothes, and the knowledge that she had done what she could, and it might not be enough sitting in her chest like a stone she had swallowed. Ethan was behind her. She knew this without turning around, because she had become attuned to his presence, the way you become attuned to weather, not looking for it, but always aware of its approach. Crane's investigator is back in the capital, he said. He arrived an hour ago. The stone in her chest got heavier. He was not supposed to report until tomorrow, she said. He was recalled early. Lord Ashworth requested an accelerated briefing. Ashworth, the oldest, the one who had watched everything at dinner with eyes that moved like searchlights, the one who had not believed the agriculture lie. Then we have less time than we thought, Claire said. We have no time, Ethan said. Claire, listen to me. I can still get you out. There is a border crossing to the east that the Conclave does not monitor because they believe it is impassable in winter. It is not winter. You can reach it in 2 days on horseback. No. This is not a request. This is a realistic assessment of your survival options. My survival options improved significantly the moment I decided to stop running from things that should be fought. You cannot fight the Conclave. I am not fighting the Conclave. I am curing a disease they created. Those are different things. Fighting is what you do when you have no better option. I have a better option. She turned to face him. In the low light of the kitchen, with the ovens banked and the bread rising in the warmth of the stones, he looked less like a king and more like what he actually was. A man standing in a kitchen at 1 a.m, trying to save someone who did not want to be saved because she was too busy saving everyone else. What is your better option, he said. I go back to the laboratory, your laboratory, the one beneath the library, with your sigil on the door. And I replace every container of the weaponized compound with the neutralized version. If I do it correctly, which I will, the Conclave will not realize what has happened until they attempt to deploy the next batch. And when they do, it will not work. Ethan stared at her. That will take days. It will take 1 day. I have already mapped the laboratory layout. I know the container system. I know the chemical structure of the weaponized compound, and I know how to neutralize it without altering the visual appearance of the solution. They will test it by sight, and it will look identical. They will not test it by deployment, because deployment takes weeks. And when they eventually discover what you have done, by then, the evidence of what they have been doing will be in the hands of people who can use it. I have been documenting everything since the first night: the formulas, the shipping manifests, the production logs, the dosage calculations. I have copies, multiple copies, distributed through the network to people in 4 different kingdoms who have the medical expertise to understand exactly what they are looking at. The silence in the kitchen was the silence of a man recalculating the structural load-bearing capacity of everything he thought he knew about a person. Ethan looked at Claire. He looked at the doorway Daniel had disappeared through. He looked at his own hands, which were no longer shaking, which had not shaken in 5 days, which had been steady since the first morning he carried glass tubes up 4 flights of stairs, and learned that his hands worked fine as long as they were working for something that mattered. "You planned this from the beginning," he said. "I planned the cure from the beginning. The rest I planned from the moment you showed me the laboratory. You did not tell me. You would have tried to stop me. Yes. And that would have wasted time we did not have." He closed his eyes, opened them. There was something in his expression that Claire had not seen before. Not in the throne room, not in the library, not in the workshop where they sat on the stone floor, while silence did the work of words. It was not gratitude, it was not admiration, it was the look of a man who has been holding up a ceiling for 6 years and has just been told that someone is coming with a support beam. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Exactly what you have been giving them. The performance. The broken king. The puppet who drinks too much wine and stares at the walls. Keep their eyes on you. Keep them watching the show. And when the morning comes, and the evidence is out, and the laboratory is neutralized, be ready to walk away." Walk away from what? From the crown. From the throne. From all of it. They cannot hurt you with the crown if you are not wearing it. He was quiet for a long time. In the kitchen, the bread was rising, the yeast doing its invisible work in the dark, and Claire thought about the strange similarity between fermentation and revolution. Both were processes that happened slowly, quietly, in warmth, and both produced something that the raw ingredients could never have become on their own. "Where would I go?" he said. The question was not practical. It was existential. It was the question of a man who has been defined by a role for so long that the removal of the role feels like the removal of bones. "I know a clinic in the southern provinces that needs a second pair of hands," Claire said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The bread rose. The next 30 hours were the most precise and the most dangerous of Claire's life, and she had lived through 4 years of border warfare, so the bar was not low. She entered the laboratory at 3 in the morning, through the panel in the library, down the spiral staircase, into the chemical cold of the underground room. She carried a bag containing the neutralizing agent, a set of syringes calibrated to the exact volume of each container, and a notebook in which she had pre-calculated every measurement because there would be no time for math in the dark. She worked by candlelight, 1 container at a time. Uncap, inject the neutralizing agent, swirl, recap. The solution maintained its visual appearance perfectly. Same color, same viscosity, same faint chemical smell. The only difference was that it would no longer function as a weapon. It would sit in its containers, looking exactly like the instrument of death it had been designed to be, and it would do nothing at all. She moved through the laboratory, like a surgeon through an operating room, each movement planned, each step silent, each breath controlled. She did not think about what would happen if she was caught. She did not think about Lord Ashworth's watching eyes, or Lord Crane's calculating smile, or the guards in the East Wing who reported to people who would not hesitate to make her the 4th name on a list of women who should have left when they had the chance. She thought about Nora, 7 years old, the worst when she left. She thought about Daniel running through the night with 40 vials strapped to his chest. She thought about the sound of children coughing, and she worked faster. By noon, she had neutralized every container in the laboratory, all of them. 60 years of weaponized research, rendered inert in 9 hours by a woman with a bag of syringes, and the kind of focus that only comes from having watched enough people die to know exactly what you are preventing. She also photographed every page of every notebook in the laboratory, using a small device that Daniel had brought from the Capitol's document house. The photographs were crude but legible. They showed the research, the formulas, the production schedules, the list of target villages, the projected casualty figures, written in the same meticulous handwriting that documented the chemical compositions, as if the deaths of children were a data set no different from the temperature readings on a distillation log. The photographs went into envelopes. The envelopes went into the network. By the time Claire climbed back up the spiral staircase and emerged through the panel into the library, 4 copies of the Conclave's research were already moving outward, carried by runners to the medical academies of 4 neighboring kingdoms. She sat down at the oak table, the same table where she had fallen asleep, the same table where the ink had printed equations on her cheek. She put her hands flat on the scarred wood, and she breathed. It was done. Not finished. Done is not the same as finished. Done is the moment when the mechanism has been set in motion and the outcome is no longer in your hands. Finished is what happens after. Claire did not know what finished would look like. She knew what done felt like. It felt like the space between an exhale and an inhale, the moment of absolute stillness where the body has emptied itself and has not yet decided to fill again. She stayed at the table until Ethan found her. He came through the library door, not the panel, and he sat across from her, and he looked at her face and read the answer there. "It is done," she said. He nodded. Then he did something that surprised them both. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, not squeezing, not holding, just resting there, the way you place your hand on a surface to confirm it is solid, to confirm that the thing you are touching is real and present and not a dream manufactured by 6 years of sleeplessness. Her hand was warm. His hand was cold. The temperature difference was notable, and neither of them moved to correct it. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Tomorrow came wearing the face of an ordinary morning. The palace woke at 6, as it always did, with the sound of servants opening shutters and guards changing positions, and the kitchen beginning the daily production of bread that the king would not eat because the king had not eaten breakfast willingly in 3 years. The sun came through the east windows at the angle it always came through at this time of year, painting the stone corridors in pale gold that made the palace look, for approximately 20 minutes, like a place where good things might happen. At 7, Lord Crane received the investigator's report. At 7:30, he called an emergency session of the conclave. At 8, the conclave made a decision. Claire was not in the palace when the decision was made. She had left at 4 in the morning, visibly, publicly, with packed bags and a hired escort, walking through the main gate where the guards recorded departures in a logbook that Lord Grey reviewed every evening. She wore traveling clothes. She carried a medical bag. She looked, to anyone watching, like a field medic who had finished her research and was returning to the southern provinces where she belonged. The guards watched her go. The servants watched her go. Lord Ashworth's informant, a kitchen boy with sharp ears and sharper ambitions, watched her go and sent a message to the palace before her horse had cleared the city gates. By 9, the conclave was satisfied. The field medic had left. The disturbance was over. The king's latest fixation had done what all the others eventually did. She had walked away, or been made to walk away, or been given the kind of information that makes walking away feel like the only option. It did not matter which. What mattered was that the palace was quiet again, the archives were quiet again, and the machine could continue running the way it had run for 100 years, smoothly and without interruption. At 10, Lord Crane proposed that the king be removed. Not immediately, not violently, administratively, a declaration of unfitness. The evidence was compelling and had been assembled over 5 years with the patient thoroughness of people who understand that the best trap is one the prey builds himself. The king drank excessively. The king suffered from episodes of confusion and paranoia. The king had formed an inappropriate attachment to a common-born woman, a field medic with no connections and no standing, and had granted her unsupervised access to the royal archives for a period of 3 weeks. The king's behavior was erratic, unstable, and a danger to the governance of Valdren. Every piece of evidence was real. Every piece had been performed by Ethan on purpose, over 5 years, to keep the conclave's eyes on his deterioration and away from his resistance. And now the performance was being used as the instrument of his removal, and he sat in the throne room while the legal documents were read aloud, and he did not fight it. He did not fight it because fighting it was not the plan. The plan was already running. It had been running since 4 in the morning, when Claire walked out the main gate and the guards wrote her name in the logbook, and it had kept running while the conclave met and decided and drafted and stamped. The plan was not inside the palace. The plan was inside the network. Claire had not left. She had walked out the main gate, ridden half a mile down the southern road, turned east into a forest path that the conclave did not monitor because it led to a mill that had been abandoned for 20 years, and circled back to the city through the merchant quarter. By 8 she was in the home of a printer named Oliver, a man who produced pamphlets and broadsheets for the city markets and who owed Claire a debt that went back to the border wars, when she had saved his brother's life with a field surgery that no sane physician would have attempted and that no official record documented because official records did not cover miracles performed in mud. Oliver printed the documents, not the photographs. Those had already left the city through the runner network, but the written account. Claire had spent the previous night composing it, sitting at the oak table in the library for the last time, writing in the clear, direct language of a medical report, because medical reports do not embellish and do not persuade. They present evidence, they describe findings, they let the data do the work. The report documented everything: the laboratory, the production of the weaponized compound, the 60-year history of the project, the target villages, the projected casualty figures, the 3 women who had discovered fragments of the truth and had been silenced in 3 different ways, the king's position as a figurehead, controlled and constrained by the conclave, bearing the blame for their operations while having no power to stop them. Oliver printed 200 copies. By noon, they were distributed throughout the capital, in market stalls, in taverns, in the guild halls where merchants and craftsmen gathered to discuss business, in the foreign embassies, where diplomats read them and immediately dispatched couriers to their home governments. At 1 in the afternoon, while the conclave was still drafting the legal language for the king's removal, the first embassy sent a formal inquiry. By 2, there were 4. By 3, the ambassador from the Eastern Kingdom, Lady Margot Ashby's homeland, arrived at the palace gates with a military escort and a document demanding full access to the laboratory described in the report. Lord Crane received the ambassador in the West Hall, the same room where the dinner had been held, the same table, the same chairs. The ambassador was polite. The military escort was not. They were not there for diplomacy. They were there because the report described a biological weapon that had been tested on Valdren's own population and was intended for deployment against neighboring kingdoms. And when a neighboring kingdom discovers that its neighbor has been building a weapon designed to kill its children, politeness is a courtesy extended for exactly as long as it takes to confirm the facts. Lord Crane denied everything. Of course he did. He was a man who had built his life on the principle that denial, delivered with sufficient confidence and sufficient authority, is indistinguishable from truth. He denied the laboratory. He denied the research. He denied the weaponized compound and the target lists and the 60 years of development. He suggested that the report was a fabrication, produced by a disgruntled field medic who had been dismissed from the palace for inappropriate behavior. The ambassador asked to see the laboratory. Lord Crane said there was no laboratory. The ambassador produced a photograph, one of Claire's photographs, delivered by the runner network, showing a row of glass containers labeled with village names and dosage calculations, sitting in a room beneath the library of the royal palace of Valdren. Lord Crane's face did something interesting. It did not crumble. It did not fall. It rearranged. The pleasantness that he wore like a uniform shifted, and beneath it, for just a moment, was the face of a man who has spent his entire life controlling outcomes and has just encountered an outcome he did not control. The laboratory was opened. The ambassador's escort searched it. They found the containers, the notebooks, the equipment, the production logs. They found everything exactly as Claire had documented it, with one exception. The containers had been neutralized. Every one, the weaponized compound, tested by the ambassador's own military chemists on site, was inert. It could not infect anyone. It could not spread. It could not harm a single child in a single village anywhere in the world. It was, chemically speaking, nothing more dangerous than a particularly expensive glass of water. This did not exonerate the conclave. The notebooks alone were damning. The production logs alone were damning. The list of target villages, with projected casualty figures written in Lord Crane's own handwriting, was so damning that the ambassador's legal counsel required 30 minutes alone in a quiet room before he could articulate the charges in language appropriate for an official document. The 5 members of the conclave were taken into custody by the combined authority of 4 foreign ambassadors, acting under an emergency mutual defense protocol that had existed for decades but had never been invoked, because no one had ever imagined it would need to be. Lord Crane went quietly. Lady Vane went with dignity. Lord Grey went with the bewildered expression of a man who has never, in his entire life, been told no. Lord Blackthorn went with his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein in his temple pulsed visibly, and he said nothing, which was the loudest thing he had said all day. Lord Ashworth went last. He paused at the door of the West Hall and looked back at the room, at the table, at the chairs, where he had sat for 60 years, making decisions that shaped a kingdom and destroyed its most vulnerable people. He looked at the room the way you look at a house you are leaving for the last time. Not with regret, but with the cold recognition that the structure you built was never as permanent as you believed. Then he walked out, flanked by soldiers from 3 different kingdoms, and the door closed behind him. Ethan signed the abdication papers at 4 in the afternoon. The papers had been drafted by the conclave for his removal. He signed them voluntarily. The legal effect was the same, but the meaning was different, and meaning, in the end, was the only thing he had ever controlled. He signed with a steady hand. The pen did not shake. The signature was clean and precise, and looked nothing like the jagged scrawl he had been performing for 5 years. The scrawl of a man whose motor control was deteriorating. The scrawl that had been entered into evidence as proof of his unfitness. The real Ethan Hale had beautiful handwriting. He simply had not used it in a long time. The palace emptied. Not immediately, not all at once, but with the gradual, inevitable deflation of a structure whose internal pressure has been released. Diplomats filed reports. Soldiers secured the laboratory. Servants opened windows that had been closed for years, and the air that came in smelled like the city outside, like bread and horses and the particular metallic tang of a capital that was about to learn that everything it thought it knew about its king was wrong. Claire came back to the palace at sunset. She entered through the kitchen, because the kitchen was the door she knew, and because she was, despite everything she had accomplished in the last 48 hours, still a field medic from the border who felt more comfortable entering buildings through the service entrance. She found Ethan in the library. The oak table, the scarred wood, the shelves of books that had outlasted 3 kings and 5 conspiracies, and the slow, grinding machinery of institutional evil. He was sitting in her chair, holding one of the medical texts she had been reading, running his thumb over the crease she had left in the corner of page 47, the same page that had printed itself on her cheek the night she fell asleep, and he carried her to safety. She sat across from him. Neither spoke. The library was quiet. Not the tense quiet of a room where secrets are being kept, but the expansive quiet of a room where secrets have been told, and the air has finally been allowed to settle. A message from Daniel arrived through the network that evening. It was longer than his usual reports. It described the villages, the children, the coughing that had stopped, the black residue that was clearing from their lungs, the girl named Nora, 7 years old, who had been the worst when Claire left, and who was now sitting up in bed, eating soup, and asking her mother when the lady doctor would come back. Claire read the message, folded it, put it in her pocket, next to the first message, the one that said kids are breathing. "The Southern Clinic needs a second pair of hands," she said. Ethan looked at her, looked at the book, looked at the throne room door, visible at the end of the corridor, hanging crooked on its hinges from the day's events. He closed the book. 2 months later, a village clinic in the southern provinces, built from local stone and roofed with timber, donated by the same merchants who had once paid the conclave's taxes without question, because questioning the conclave was not something merchants did and survived. The clinic had 2 rooms: an examination room with a table, a cabinet of medicines, and a window that looked out onto the village square, where children played in the particular reckless manner of children who have been sick and recovered and now understand, in the way that only children can, that being alive is an activity best performed at full speed. And a second room with a desk, a shelf of medical texts, and a chair that Ethan had built himself, because he discovered, to his own surprise, that his hands worked as well with wood as they did with pharmaceutical formulas. He was not a doctor, he was learning. Claire taught him with the same flat precision she applied to everything, correcting his technique without softening the correction, expecting competence and receiving it, treating him exactly as she treated every other person in her clinic, which is to say, as a human being capable of growth and worthy of the time required to grow. He was learning to take a pulse, specifically, the pulse of a 7-year-old girl named Nora, who came to the clinic every Tuesday for a checkup and who had decided, with the absolute conviction of a child who has survived something she was not supposed to survive, that Ethan was her personal property. "Your hands are cold," Nora told him, "because children do not filter observations through politeness. They are always cold," he said. "It is a medical condition called being from the north. Claire's hands are warm. Claire is a better person than I am. This is well documented." Nora considered this with the seriousness of someone evaluating a scientific claim. "Your hands are still cold," she concluded, and reached for his fingers, and held them between her own small palms, and warmed them. Ethan held still. He looked down at the child's hands wrapped around his, and something moved behind his eyes that was not the old flicker, the door opening and closing. This was a window, opening, staying open. Claire watched from the doorway. She did not smile. Smiling was not something she did with her mouth. It was something she did with the rest of her, with the way she stood, the way she leaned against the doorframe, the way her hands hung at her sides, open, not fisted, not braced against impact, not pressed flat against doors or tables or stone floors to stop the shaking. Open. The whisper network of the kingdom, the same network that had once carried warnings about a monster king who destroyed everyone who came close to him, carried a different story now. It moved through market stalls and taverns and the field medic channels where information traveled faster than horses. It was not dramatic. It was not poetic. It was the kind of story that people tell not because it is extraordinary, but because it is true. She survived the night in the Alpha King's arms. And somehow, impossibly, so did he.